Before we start, we want to big up New Scientist Live, our award-winning festival of ideas and discovery.
The ultimate place to expand your mind and feed your curiosity is returning to XL London on Saturday the 12th and Sunday the 13th of October. Over 80 exhibits, over 70 incredible speakers across 5 stages. It's everything you love about science, technology, and the world around you.
And if you can't make it to London, we'll be live streaming the talks so you can join us from the comfort of your own home. Hear some of the world's most interesting people as they discuss everything from the Big Bang to mental health, the magic of mycology, and the world's biggest flowers. If you're curious about life, the universe, and our place in it, there is a talk for you at New Scientist Live.
For more information, visit newscientist.com/nslivepod.
Hello, welcome to your weekly dose of essential science news from New Scientist. I'm Rowan Hooper, and this week with me is my colleague Chelsea White. Hello, Chelsea, how are you doing?
Good, how are you?
How's New York?
Oh, it's lovely. Fall is in full swing. How's London?
I saw a seal in the river yesterday.
No.
How about that? Yeah. Do you get small mammals in the Hudson?
Well, I haven't seen any seals in the Hudson, but it is the whale migration season, so I'm hoping to go down to the South Shore and see some humpbacks.
Wow. God, she's beaten me.
Yeah.
Can't get there. Yeah.
I mean, I'm just hoping.
Should we talk about some science?
Yeah, of course. On the show this week, we're going to discuss the moving story of the death of an ancient human 17,000 years ago. And we're hearing why we're in the golden era of exoplanetary science.
We're also going to discuss the implications for what is the first drone versus drone war in Ukraine. But we're going to start by talking about coral. Now, you'll have heard us talk about the threat to coral from climate change and the frankly terrible implications if we lose coral reefs around the world.
Yeah, the problem, in a nutshell, is that high water temperatures stress corals, and that can lead to mass bleaching and death. And at just 1.5 degrees of warming, and I can't quite believe I said that, we do expect to see significant losses of corals.
Yeah, before we get in it, though, I just wanted to step back a bit because we do often talk about coral and bleaching, and it just starts to feel a bit abstract, doesn't it? Because coral is,
yeah, it's this amazing thing. It's incredible. I love corals.
Yeah, and it's so diverse. It supports so much life, and it covers a vast area of ocean. People call the coral reefs the rainforests of the sea, and we really should value them like we do the rainforest, except we're chopping them down as well. But you know what I mean.
It's tough, though. They're sort of out of sight, out of mind, I think, for a lot of people.
Yeah, well, exactly. The figure that gets put about a lot is that if we do, or when we do get to 1.5 degrees, we'll lose 70 to 90% of coral. But if we get to 2 degrees, we will lose more than 99% of coral.
And it's not just the coral, right? It's everything they support. It's all the protection they give to coastlines around the world. All of that goes.
Yeah, right. So that's the background. But there was a paper this week in a Royal Society journal that suggests that corals might be able to hang on a bit longer because they may be more capable of adapting to hotter and more acidic oceans than we thought.
Yeah, so when I mentioned ocean warming, that's dangerous for corals, but the acidity is also a problem because the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere gets absorbed by the ocean, and that makes it more acidic, and then that can weaken the skeleton of the corals. So in that study, which was reported by our environment reporter James Deneen, scientists in Hawaii grew corals in an outdoor lab under lots of different conditions to simulate what would happen in a warmer climate.
Yeah, and for 6 months they grew them and they were able to really test them. And all the corals, there are 8 species, they showed lower growth rates, which is a measure of coral health, under these more stressful conditions. And yet, despite that, all of them actually survived. All the species survived the stress, and there wasn't really a clear trade-off between tolerance to heat and acidity. So I asked Chris Jury of the University of Hawaii what we project in the future and what the study shows.
Most projections of the future of coral reefs are that reefs will utterly collapse over the next few decades due to climate change. However, many of those projections rely on the assumption that corals simply aren't able to adapt fast enough to make a meaningful difference. In this study, we tested that assumption by examining the scope for corals to adapt to ocean warming and ocean acidification. Surprisingly, All 8 of the coral species show clear capacity to adapt to the changing ocean conditions over the next 50 years. But critically, they can only adapt so much and so fast. None of the 8 species we examined appear to be capable of keeping up with a high business-as-usual climate change scenario. Instead, under a low climate change scenario, like that targeted under the Paris Climate Agreement, then we see that all 8 species can likely adapt fast enough to keep up. Climate change mitigation is absolutely essential if corals are going to survive over the coming decades. But if we achieve that goal, then corals have a fighting chance.
So, corals have a fighting chance.
It's kind of incredible. That's the most positive news I've heard about corals in such a long time. So none of the species can adapt fast, but they can adapt fast enough under 1.5 degrees, which, of course, we're pretty much committed to. But just to bring us back to Earth a bit, this is a small study, right?
Yeah, it is. We can't sort of just say, oh, yeah, it's all going to be fine now, because we don't know if these studies will apply more broadly, and we've had a lot of die-off already after extreme weather events. So I asked Terry Hughes about this. He's really the go-to professor for coral. He's director of the Centre of Excellence for Coral Reef Studies at James Cook University in Australia, one of the leading authorities on coral resilience. He said the problem with the Hawaii study, and that this is quite a big problem, was that it was conducted in winter.
While the results of the outdoor tank experiments are very interesting, they don't reflect the conditions experienced by wild corals. The experimental corals were exposed to a 2-degree pulse in temperature in the middle of winter in February and March, when ambient sea temperatures in Hawaii were at their lowest. But mass bleaching of corals occurs in nature only in summer, if sea temperatures spike above the normal summer maximum. In the tanks, only 1% of the experimental corals died due to an extra 2 degrees of heat in winter. In nature, 2 degrees of extra heat over the course of a hot summer can kill off half or more of a coral population. Coral bleaching and coral mortality is highly selective, affecting some individuals and species more than others. The mix of coral species has already changed drastically on reefs around the world. The outlook for reefs in 50 years' time hinges on how quickly we can cut emissions to zero and stabilize temperatures. Unfortunately, it's going to get worse for coral reefs before it gets better.
It's some job, isn't it, to work on such a difficult and huge problem?
Yeah, it is. I asked Chris Jury about this, the Hawaii guy. You know, corals are disappearing on our watch. Emissions reductions aren't happening fast enough. And, you know, how do you cope with that? Here's what he said.
Coral reefs are complex ecosystems, and for any system, it becomes more challenging to predict the cascading effects of changing some of its parts. This is a major scientific challenge, but one that I think is tractable and an area where we are making progress very quickly. Perhaps the bigger challenge is the uncertainty in what exactly society decides to do about climate change, as well as local stressors, such as destructive fishing practices or coastal pollution. We know very well how to kill coral reefs, either with climate change, local stressors, or a combination of both. What we don't know is whether or not society will rise to the challenge. In spite of these challenges, I remain hopeful because I know that we still have an opportunity to preserve coral reefs if we take it.
And now to outer space. We're living through somewhat of a golden age for finding exoplanets, and this week we found out that Barnard's star, which is our closest single stellar neighbor after the 3 stars in the Alpha Centauri system, actually has a planet orbiting it, and it might have more. So 20 years ago, this would have been, an enormous discovery, but now it's sort of become the norm for astronomers. Alex Wilkins reported on this. Alex, can you fill us in on this Barnard's star planet?
Yeah, so it's actually been quite a long saga looking for a planet specifically around Barnard's star. Astronomers have been looking since the 1960s with a few false dawns along the way where astronomers thought they might have found a planet but turned out not to be. The most recent was in 2018 when researchers put out this Nature paper and they claimed to have found a planet that was at least 3 times larger than Earth, which they called Barnard's star B. But they followed it up and found that the apparent planet was actually just higher than expected stellar activity. But now astronomers say they actually have found a planet orbiting extremely close to Barnard's star. It's not quite as large as Earth, but it's probably rocky, but it's also so close that it's probably too hot for life as well. But even having said that, it's one of our closest planetary neighbours, and it kind of marks the end of this long saga for looking for a planet.
It does feel like every other week we're hearing about a new exoplanet. Is this the golden age, or is it possibly going to get more golden?
Well, we'll have to see. I hope it does. Astronomers have been looking for exoplanets for almost as long as there have been astronomers themselves. But until recently, the technology just wasn't really there. Starting in the 1990s, though, we were able to record how stars moved in the sky with much greater accuracy, which meant we could also detect tiny variations caused by these orbiting planets. The first planet around a sun-like star was detected in 1995, and since then, in that 30-year period, it's been a deluge. We're not far now from 6,000 confirmed exoplanets.
Wow, that's an enormous number. How have we discovered so many of them?
So most of those 6,000 planets were found by this telescope called the Kepler Space Telescope, which used the star brightness transit method, which I mentioned earlier. But we've now got newer purpose-built telescopes to look for exoplanets in new ways. And we've got things like NASA's Transiting Exoplanet Survey satellite. Now, that satellite only launched in 2018, but 4 years later in 2022, it found a further 5,000 candidate planets, though they haven't all been confirmed. There are also lots of new telescopes on Earth being built just for planet hunting. And of course, new telescopes we have for investigating known planets has also come on leaps and bounds, like the James Webb Space Telescope.
When I was reading about Barnard's star, I remembered Project Daedalus. Do you know about this?
I think it was before my time.
Yeah, before my time. It was this was a plan in the 70s to send a spacecraft to Barnard's star by detonating a string of nuclear bombs behind it the shockwave would accelerate the vehicle to 12% the speed of light.
Wow, I love that. Let's do it.
Let's do it. Well, I mean, it's a good way to get rid of some nuclear weapons, isn't it?
Exactly.
Alex, you were at a planetary science conference recently. Was there any news on when we might find, the Earth twin exoplanet that really looks like Earth?
Yeah, so things are definitely progressing in that direction. We've found some planets that have similar masses to Earth, but these tend to be around stars much smaller than our sun. These stars called M-dwarfs. M-dwarfs are the most common star in our galaxy, and their low masses means it's really easy to detect lower mass or Earth mass planets. But these planetary systems also look extremely different from our own sun, and the planets are often bathed in radiation extremely close to their stars, which makes them really unlikely to be habitable or suitable for life. But new instruments like the ones I mentioned earlier are becoming able to detect low-mass planets around much larger stars like our sun. Barnard's star, for instance, is a K-type star, which is around 80% the size of our sun. And finding a planet around the star that's around the same mass as Earth would have been unthinkable 20 years ago. So it's amazing to see the progress we've made, and I'd say watch this space.
Let's go back in time now to southern Italy, 17,000 years ago. Scientists have been able to describe life back then in surprising detail thanks to DNA from a child. Sam Wong is here to explain. Sam, what's the story?
Yeah, so back in 1998, some researchers discovered the skeleton of a child in a cavern called Grotta delle Mura in Puglia in the south of Italy. The body had been carefully covered with rock slabs in the floor. Now they've gone back to those remains to get DNA out of the bones. And it's quite unusual for remains of this age to get well-preserved DNA because it's in a warm climate like southern Italy as well. But the cool conditions in the cavern help to preserve the bones and the DNA in them. And the technology for analysing ancient DNA has improved loads in recent years. So we're doing more and more of these stories about ancient DNA, and they've been able to sequence about 75% of his genome, which is really remarkable, and we can learn an awful lot from that.
Wow. So do we know first how he died?
Well, he died when he was about 16 and a half months old. We don't know for sure the reason why, but he did have a congenital heart condition called familial hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, which causes thickening of the heart muscle, and it can lead to congestive heart failure and death, even in young people.
It's funny, isn't it? I find myself back in this cave 17,000 years ago with this family with a little 16-month-year-old. I find it quite moving how it's bringing us there, this new analysis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the details that we can get from it are really fascinating. So his parents, we know, were closely related. They were probably first cousins, which is not that common in ancient populations. The boy had dark curly hair and dark skin, darker than most modern Europeans, but not as dark as people from tropical climates. And he had blue eyes, which might sound surprising given that his skin was dark, but it's actually fits with a lot of the European hunter-gatherers from this time. We know as well that he had genes for lactose intolerance. So if he had lived to adulthood, he wouldn't have been able to digest milk. So babies have the lactase enzyme that means they can digest lactose, but only thousands of years after this boy's lifetime did it become common for the enzyme to persist into adulthood, which allowed people to drink the milk of domesticated animals throughout their lives.
And apart from the DNA, were there other kinds of evidence that can tell us something about this boy's life?
Yeah, he had a fracture in his collarbone, which suggests he might have had a difficult birth. And the researchers also analysed these strontium isotopes in his teeth, which can tell us something about the geology of the region where he lived. So there was very little variation in the isotope pattern, which suggests that his mother stayed in one area during pregnancy, which is not necessarily what you'd expect of a hunter-gatherer group. One of the researchers told us that they imagined she lived in quite a close-knit community and her daily life might have involved gathering food, but she was rooted in the local environment. It's
really extraordinary that we can paint that detailed a picture. Is there, anything else we got to learn about this family?
Yeah, so the time when the child lived was just after the last glacial maximum, which is the coldest stage of the glacial period. So it was a time of great transformation when the climate was getting warmer and humans were expanding into new areas. This child had ancestry from a group called Villa Bruna, who were named after a rock shelter in northern Italy. And this genetic ancestry is found to be widespread in Italy about 14,000 years ago, a bit later than the boy. But these findings will tell us that the Villa Bruna people had already expanded into southern Italy earlier than we thought previously. They replaced a group called the Gravettian people who'd been in Italy for the previous 15,000 years or so. So it appears that there was a sort of population turnover in the region sometime before this boy's lifetime.
So does this mean that the ancestral Italians got to Italy quicker than we thought they did?
Yes, these particular ancestral Italians. So I think that group then stayed in Italy until about 7,000 years ago. And then there was another migration and there are all these kind of population shifts that we can work out from the ancient DNA now.
Now, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has been dubbed the first drone war. Some sources suggest that small drones are now inflicting as much as 80% of the damage to military hardware and personnel. So the war has evolved now to see machines fighting machines on a daily basis in a way that we've never seen before. We've been reporting on this week. News editor Jacob Erin is here to tell us about it. Jacob, how has the conflict changed?
So initially, drone combat in Ukraine was restricted to essentially Russian and Ukraine drones encountering each other at random, and one drone operator would sort of bring their drone down on the other and attempt to take it out in this sort of ad hoc way. People had never tried these tactics before, but over the couple of years of the conflict, now they've developed tactics for drone-on-drone combat in a much more sophisticated way.
So these aren't quite autonomous battles between drones, right?
Not quite. So that there is evidence that Ukraine has deployed drones that are able to identify and attack targets like tanks autonomously. But so far, there's no reports of sort of a full autonomous drone-on-drone battle. The drone war really stepped up a gear this August as Ukraine fielded new software to integrate its drone operations with its air defense radar, and this allowed them to intercept Russian long-range reconnaissance drones. And in fact, a Ukrainian drone maker called Wild Hornets has been releasing videos showing how they've been able to intercept Russian drones. And over a period of a few months, they seem to have made over 100 interceptions, which is about the same number of Russian drones taken down over the entire past year. So it's really ramping up now. And Wild Hornets tells us that they're really poking out the eyes of the enemy. Their ability to temporarily blind Russian surveillance appears to have been a key factor in the success of Ukraine's Kursk offensive in August, which saw Ukrainian troops occupying Russian territory for the first time.
Just to ask a stupid question here, having drones fight each other, can't one side just jam the others, or send a magnetic pulse and knock them out of the sky?
So in the early days of drone combat, radio and GPS jamming, attempting to cut off the drone from its operator, was seen as a viable defense. But increasingly, there's a falling out of favor. Drone manufacturers are adding capabilities to get around jamming, such as autonomous targeting, AI controls, even deploying drones using fiber optic cables to keep in contact with the operator.
What? Like a kite?
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
And what about manufacturing these? Is Ukraine importing them, or are they making them domestically? I feel like to do this, you would need so many of them. And then you get this arms race between Ukraine and Russia to get around each other's drone capabilities.
So what's really key is because these drones are so cheap, they can use so many of them and they can be disposable. And both sides have domestic manufacturers. Some are literally sort of hobbyists in their garage putting together drones. There are sort of more traditional defense firms as well, but they're also importing from allies. So the UK has promised Ukraine 10,000 drones, while Russia is buying a lot of its drones from Iran. And in terms of the arm race, Russia has a drone called the Lancet. It's quite a large one. It's 12 kilos, 2-meter wingspan. And Russia has used it to hunt down and attack Ukraine's artillery from over 40 kilometers away. Until recently, Ukraine wasn't able to combat this drone. But now they've developed a technique to use what's called first-person view drones. So you might have seen pictures of soldiers wearing weird VR gear where they're controlling drones to be able to fly their drone into the Lancet drone and take it down.
It's so futuristic. But it's also not just drones in the air, right? There's boat drones and land drones.
That's the really incredible thing. It really is sort of across all domains of the war. So on the water, there are kamikaze boats known as uncrewed surface vessels, or USVs. They're being used in the Black Sea. And there are also land drones, uncrewed ground vehicles. They've been used to transport food, water, ammunition, the last few dangerous miles to the front line. They're also used for mine laying. Some are equipped with weapons. And of course, they're now taking each other out, being taken out by first-person view drones and so on.
So is this future war? And is it weirdly a good thing if machines destroy each other rather than destroy humans?
That's the interesting question, right? Is can you fight a war that involves no one actually dying because machines are just fighting each other? Some people believe it is possible. We might end up essentially having humans as spectators in their own wars. But there's an interesting quote, someone speaking on Russian TV in 2017, who said, when one party's drones are destroyed by drones of another, it will have no choice but to surrender. And that was Vladimir Putin. So he's obviously been thinking about this for some time.
That's all for this week. Thanks to all our guests, and thanks to you for listening. Do tell your friends about us and give us a 5-star rating and a review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts.
And there's always more from New Scientist on our website at newscientist.com. We'll be back next week. Bye for now.
Bye.
This podcast is produced by OG Podcasts. Find out more at ogpodcasts.co.uk.